It began, as many Oxford winters do, with the faint sound of a bell heard through drizzle. I remember it not as an event, but as a tone, hollow, measured, and without conclusion. The sort of sound that makes you pause mid-step on the worn flagstones of St. Oswald's Quad and wonder what, precisely, it is morning. I had no reason to be there that afternoon. Curiosity, perhaps, or restlessness masquerading as intellect. The college was still breathing its first sigh of Hilary Term, tutors resurfacing from Christmas indolence, students hurrying to tutorials with their collars raised, and the porter, always the same porter it seemed, nodding at each as if their youth were both admirable and faintly irritating. Inside the chapel, the air smelled of candle wax and linen polish. I sat alone beneath the carved saints, their eyes rubbed pale by centuries of glances. The bell rang again. It was not a call to service, not the ordinary summoning of devout or dutiful. It was slower, as though rung by someone uncertain of its purpose. I've always found that uncertainty more moving than faith. Afterwards, I walked toward the porter's lodge. He was bent over a ledger, the sort of man who polishes his spectacles between sentences and thinks twice before offering any. He told me the bell had been rung in remembrance of Dr. Paul Latimer. Natural causes, they said. The phrase has always sounded suspiciously like mercy dressed as science. I asked how long Latimer had been dead. 3 days. The memorial notice had only gone up that morning, tacked to the notice board near the senior common room. Thin paper, thumbtacked through with administrative reluctance. I pretended to have known Latimer. In truth, I remembered him only faintly. An academic voice in an old program of the Third, speaking on the moral decay of Victorian verse. There had been wit in his phrasing, a sort of humane exasperation. I'd thought then that he was the kind of man who laughed privately. Not often. The porter said Latimer had resigned the year before. Something about illness, or pressure, or pride. Nobody quite remembered. Colleges forget people the way libraries misplace volumes, without malice, and only noticed when someone goes looking for them. I thanked him and stepped back into the quad. Rain stitched itself into the flagstones. The sound was soft, precise. From the corner of my eye, I saw a young man, a student perhaps, pinning something to the board. I lingered long enough to watch him smooth it flat, then leave. It was another notice, a kind of administrative echo. Under the black-bordered memorial to Latimer, a small line of typed words had been added. Temporary vacancy. Tutorial Fellow in English Literature. That was Oxford's way of grieving. I lit a cigarette beneath the cloister, more for the ritual than the comfort. Across the court, the windows of the Fellow's staircase glowed with an amber calm. I imagined sherry glasses, polite laughter, an anecdote told. Twice. The living, always so eager to resume the pattern. Still, something about that bell refused to leave me. Its second toll had been sharper, as if struck by a different hand. Perhaps I imagined it. Perhaps I wanted to. A sound like that, hesitant, almost personal, belonged less to ceremony than to conscience. Back in my flat, later, I poured myself a measure of whiskey and read the Oxford Mail. There was a brief obituary. Dr. Paul Latimer, aged 52, formerly of St. Oswald's College, died suddenly at his residence. He is remembered for his contributions to Victorian studies and his devotion to teaching. No mention of family, no cause specified. Only the word suddenly. That word is a detective's kind of music. I found an old college directory and traced his name. A single annotation beside it, written in my own scrawl from years ago. Guest lecture. Integrity of verse. I wondered, absurdly, what I'd meant by it. Integrity was not a word one applied lightly to men. The clock struck 9, the rain thickened, and somewhere in the maze of colleges, another bell began to toll for evening prayer. But my thoughts returned to the first bell, the uncertain one, rung too slowly, too late. Hilary Term had begun, yes, but something in its opening note already carried the promise of a requiem. Now and then, I find myself walking through that same quad, listening for echoes that never quite fade. Each time I tell myself the same thing, that Oxford stones do not lie, only forget selectively. But on that night, as the wind caught the chapel door and left it slightly ajar, I felt the distinct and troubling sense that the city was trying to tell me something I had not yet earned the right to hear. And so it began, with a bell that tolled for a man I scarcely knew, and a silence that would not quite let me go. It was Lewis who brought me the letter, though he didn't know then that he was bringing me anything of consequence. He'd stopped by my flat on his way home, carrying a brown envelope from the college porter. "Routine," he said. The college wanted the coroner's copy of the death report. I nodded, poured 2 cups of tea, and left him to rummage through the papers. It was he who found it, an envelope within an envelope. Smaller, lighter, addressed not to me, but to the bursar, St. Oswald's College. The handwriting was faintly tremulous, the kind of script that tries to appear confident and fails halfway through the first loop. There was no postmark, no stamp. Someone had slipped it by hand into the internal mail, which at Oxford is both more private and infinitely more dangerous. Lewis thought nothing of it. I told him to leave it on the table. When he'd gone, and the flat had reclaimed its quiet, I poured myself another measure of whiskey and studied the envelope under the desk lamp. The light caught the indentation of pressure where the pen had paused, a long hesitation before the name. I could almost see Latimer's hand tremble. I opened it carefully. The paper was thin, translucent, the ink uneven. A single sentence lay in the center. "The truth cannot remain buried in Hilary Term." No signature, only the date, 2 days before Latimer died. I read it 3 times, not for meaning but for tone. Men write confessions in long, winding paragraphs. Warnings, however, are brief. This felt like neither. There was a balance to it, a rhythm that suggested not fear but a certain scholarly precision. He had wanted the sentence to be read aloud, perhaps to be heard. Hilary Term. The word struck a chord both literal and metaphoric. Oxford measures life by its terms, not its years. Every ending there is only temporary, each silence followed by the next intake of young voices. But buried truth, that is another matter. I called the porter that evening. He confirmed that the letter had been found in Latimer's pigeonhole the morning after his death, during the clearing of his personal effects. No one knew who had placed it there, or when. I asked whether anyone else had keys to the mail-room. He hesitated, said quietly that the bursar kept one, and so did the night porter. I made a note of both names, but said nothing more. Later, I tried to picture Latimer writing it. The small lamp in his rooms, the sound of the quad clock striking each half-hour, his pen pausing as if the right phrase might save him. I imagined him walking down the corridor afterwards, the envelope in hand, slipping it quietly into the mail slot beneath the bursar's pigeonhole, then standing there for a moment, listening, perhaps, to the echo of that hollow drop. A man cannot undo a confession once made, even one disguised as a warning. I could not sleep. Around midnight, I spread the letter flat on the table and compared it with the handwriting in his old lecture notes, borrowed earlier from the archives. The curves were identical, but one thing disturbed me. The ink was darker, fresher, as if he had written it with deliberate emphasis. I traced the pressure marks with my thumb. Beneath the line, faintly impressed into the paper's grain, were the ghosts of 2 erased words. My dear. It changed everything. The letter had not been written to the bursar at all, at least not originally. It had been redirected, readdressed after hesitation, the kind of gesture that begins as intimacy and ends as regret. Outside, the rain returned, quiet and persistent. Oxford after midnight always carries the scent of stone and memory. I sat by the window, watching the lamplight on wet cobblestones, the unopened envelope now folded neatly beside the glass. Somewhere in the college, another bell marked the hour, soft and solitary. I wondered, not for the first time, whether guilt always precedes death, or sometimes follows it. The truth cannot remain buried in Hilary Term. Latimer had written that with the calm of a man who already knew he was past rescue, and I, foolishly perhaps, had begun to believe him. Dinner at St. Oswald's was one of those rituals Oxford performs with the air of something half forgotten and wholly necessary. The high table gleamed with silver under candlelight, the scent of roast beef and port mingling with the faint, dusty chill that seeps from old stone no matter the fire. The fellows spoke in tones suited to Latin prayers, every remark draped in the same courteous fatigue. I was invited, nominally, as a gesture of cooperation between the police and the college. In truth, I suspect curiosity had been the stronger motive. Nothing delights an Oxford senior common room quite like the prospect of being mildly scandalized. The bursar, Lionel Greaves, presided with an easy authority born not of intellect but of administration. He reminded me of an accountant who'd misplaced his conscience but kept excellent records of the loss. Beside him sat Dr. Adrian Fane, the classicist, whose face had the unlined calm of a man who had never rushed. Across from me, Margaret Lyle, the English tutor, lifted her glass with a grace that suggested she'd once been beautiful and knew it still mattered. Sir, they spoke of Latimer as one speaks of the recently dead, carefully, as though his ghost might be listening for mispronunciations. Fane recalled his brilliance. Greaves praised his service record. Lyle said nothing at all. When Greaves offered condolences, I murmured that sudden deaths often leave questions. His knife paused on the roast. The pause itself was instructive. He asked what sort of questions. I said the kind that seldom find answers, though I could see from his eyes that he preferred arithmetic to ambiguity. The meal unfolded like a well-rehearsed liturgy. Between courses came the Latin grace, half mumbled, half mocking. Port circulated. Conversation drifted from theology to endowments, from endowments to property, from property to Latimer again. It was Greaves who mentioned, almost absent-mindedly, that Latimer had been involved in the matter of the bequest, the estate of a certain widow who'd left money for a library fund, though there had been, as he put it, complications. Complications. The word had the density of guilt. I asked who administered the estate. Greaves smiled, a slow, bloodless thing, and said the college handled such affairs internally. He did not look at Fane, but Fane looked at his wine. There was a toast, perfunctory. When the plates were cleared, the conversation slid into reminiscence. Someone quoted a line from Tennyson. Men may rise on stepping stones of their dead selves to higher things. Fane nodded solemnly and misquoted the second half. It lodged in my mind like grit in a shoe. Scholars do not misquote poets by accident. Later, in the smoking room, the mood softened. Lyle joined me by the window overlooking the quad, where rain was tracing its fine, luminous threads across the glass. She asked whether I believed Latimer's death natural. I said belief seldom enters my work. She smiled faintly, said that Paul had believed in truth, though not always in people. Her voice wavered on his name, and she looked away as though embarrassed by the sound of it. I asked whether she had seen him in his final days. She hesitated too long before saying no. There is a rhythm to lies, and hers landed half a beat late. I let it rest. When I took my leave, the college porter was dousing the lamps in the hallway. He asked if I'd enjoyed dinner. I said the food was good, the company thought-provoking. He chuckled, said the fellows' table was where the living always pretended they weren't dining with the dead. Back at my flat, I wrote a single line in my notebook. Tennyson, misquoted by Fane. It wasn't much. But I have learned that truth often announces itself not with trumpets, but with a stumble. The night deepened. Outside, the bell struck 11, slower than it had 2 nights before. I poured the last of the port into a chipped glass and thought of Latimer, his letter, his unfinished manuscript, and the strange composure of those who had dined in his memory. Oxford had its ghosts, yes, but some, I had begun to suspect, preferred to stay seated at the table. The archives of St. Oswald's lay beneath the old library, down a flight of stone steps that seemed to have been built for smaller, more patient men. The air grew colder with each step, the kind of chill that carries its own silence. I've always found that places meant for preservation often feel more like tombs. The archivist, a narrow, apologetic man with hair the color of parchment, met me at the door. He spoke in the careful tones of someone accustomed to footnotes rather than conversation. I told him I wished to see Dr. Latimer's papers. He nodded, almost relieved, and led me through a narrow corridor lined with metal cabinets. Each drawer was labeled in a precise, spidery hand. Latimer, Paul, personal papers, restricted access, sat near the bottom, as though the dead preferred to keep their secrets low to the ground. The drawer opened with a sigh. Inside were folders, notebooks, and a small leather-bound manuscript. The archivist placed it on the table as if handling fragile bone. He told me it had been delivered by the college solicitor the day after Latimer's death. I asked if anything had been removed. He shook his head too quickly. People often mistake hesitation for honesty, but haste can be just as revealing. When he left me alone, I sat in the single wooden chair and opened the manuscript. The first page bore a title written in Latimer's hand, The Ghost of Hilary Term. Beneath it, nothing. The next few pages were filled with dense prose, half essay, half confession. He wrote of Oxford as if describing a mind slowly turning in on itself. Words about betrayal, conscience, and the peculiar loneliness of intellect. I had seen similar things written in police statements, though never so elegantly. Then a gap, several pages torn cleanly from the binding. No rough edges, no stray fibers. Whoever removed them had done so carefully, almost reverently. The first surviving paragraph began mid-sentence, and though she said silence was mercy, I began to understand that silence can also be cruelty. I felt, for the first time, the faint outline of a story forming, not the kind written in ink, but in omission. Latimer's manuscript was less a confession than a correspondence interrupted. There was one annotation in the margin, small and deliberate. M.L. Erase this, if necessary. The initials, of course, matched Margaret Lyle. I'd met many liars in my time, but few so composed as Miss Lyle. She carried her secrets like fine jewelry, visible yet untouchable. I wondered what she had asked him to erase, and why he hadn't. I turned back to the first page. The ink there was darker, fresher. Latimer must have written the title days before his death. It struck me then that he had not titled it A Ghost or the Ghost of a Man, but The Ghost of a Term, as if the haunting belonged not to a person, but to time itself. The light in the archive flickered. Somewhere above, a door creaked. The place smelled of dust and slow decay, and I could hear the faint hum of the library heater struggling against the cold. I closed the manuscript and noted that its clasp was bent, as though opened often but never fully shut. Before leaving, I asked the archivist who had first accessed Latimer's papers after his death. He blinked, said quietly that only the Bussard and Miss Lyle had been granted permission. He seemed embarrassed by the answer, as if guilt could be transferred through administrative record. At the top of the steps, I paused and looked back. The archive light had dimmed to a pale shimmer, and in that glow the long rows of cabinets seemed to recede into darkness. It was, I thought, a fitting resting place for unfinished thoughts. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick as glass. I walked across the quad, the cold biting through my coat. Somewhere behind me, the chapel bell struck once, hesitant, uncertain, as though testing its own memory. And for the first time I began to suspect that Latimer's ghost had never left the college at all. It was still there, waiting patiently between the pages of an unfinished story. Margaret Lyle's rooms were in the oldest part of St. Oswald's, up a staircase that turned too many times and ended in a door whose varnish had peeled like dry bark. The brass nameplate below the knocker had been polished recently, an act of either pride or penitence. I knocked once, lightly, and the sound disappeared into the corridor like breath on glass. From inside came a faint melody, a piano tracing the hesitant bars of Chopin's Nocturne in G minor. The notes were uneven, as if the player's mind was elsewhere. I waited until the last chord dissolved before she called for me to enter. Her sitting room was modest but ordered, with books stacked in 2s and 3s, a desk facing the window, and a single vase of white chrysanthemums that leaned slightly, as though eavesdropping. She looked up from the piano and smiled, a small, formal thing. I had not noticed before how the line of her neck carried both strength and fatigue. She asked whether I took sugar. I said no, and she poured the tea anyway. People like to believe they can sweeten the truth. I told her I had been reading Latimer's manuscript. She did not flinch, though her hand brushed the rim of the cup too hard. The sound of china against china was sharper than it should have been. She said he had been working on it until the end. Something about Victorian poets and moral decay. I asked whether the dedication to ML had been her doing. She said that Latimer was sentimental, that he liked initials, that he had used them once before in a paper on Christina Rossetti. It was the sort of answer that aims for precision, but lands in avoidance. I asked whether she had known he was unwell. She said he had been tired, that men who think too much always are. I thought of the missing pages in his manuscript and the faint indentation where something had been erased. Tired men seldom bother with erasures. The silence between us lengthened until it resembled honesty. She rose from the piano stool and moved to the window, the light catching her hair like pale smoke. She said Oxford could be cruel to those who fell out of rhythm with it, that the colleges had no use for ghosts who linger. I told her that ghosts often left more evidence than the living. She turned, half smiling, as if I had quoted something familiar. Then she said quietly that Paul Latimer had loved the sound of bells, that he once claimed the chapel's chime in G minor was the most human note in Oxford. It reminded him, she said, of contrition. I asked whether he had been contrite. She looked at me then, not with surprise, but with something like relief. She said everyone in St. Oswald's has a confession, only the living fear to write it down. When I rose to leave, I noticed a small stack of music sheets on the piano, fastened with a red ribbon. The topmost bore the title Elegy for P.L. The date was 3 days after his death. The ink had bled faintly, as if written during rain. I asked whether she composed. She said only when silence became unbearable. At the door she paused, her hand resting on the knob. She asked what I truly thought had happened. I said that truth, like music, depended on who was listening. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. On the stairwell, I could still hear the faint hum of the piano string she had struck accidentally when closing the lid. It vibrated for a long time, one low G that refused to fade. Back in my rooms, I poured myself a drink and sat by the fire. The memory of that note followed me, insistent, unresolved. G minor. A key of mourning and hesitation. Latimer's letter, his erased words, the dedication. Each detail now sounded the same faint chord. I.e., fetched the manuscript again and stared at the dedication. The loop of the M was broken, the ink darker than the rest. He had written her initials not as ornament, but as proof, an echo preserved in ink. I closed the folder. Outside, the bell of St. Oswald's began to ring, its tone low and imperfect, as though tuned to the same key. I listened until the last vibration slipped away. The city was quiet after that. Only the rain persisted, steady and unmusical, writing its own elegy on the glass. It was Lewis who brought me the photograph, folded twice and already smudged at the edges from too many curious fingers. He said it had been found in one of the college's old minute books, slipped between the pages like a pressed flower. I took it without comment, though even before opening it I felt the familiar tremor of recognition one gets before a truth half seen. The picture was dated 1968. The ink had faded to a tobacco hue, but the scene was unmistakably St. Oswald's, the Fellows' Garden, all clipped yew and shadowed stone. 4 figures stood together, young and too certain of their futures. Latimer in the center, bare-headed, slightly apart from the rest, as if anticipating the years that would estrange him. To his left, Adrian Fane, all angular charm and arrogant ease. On the right, Lionel Greaves, the same calculating poise he wore still, though then it must have passed for ambition. Between them, a woman in profile, her face turned away. The porter who'd found it said the woman was Margaret Lyle before she became Dr. Lyle. I stared at that half-turned face for a long time. The tilt of the chin, the fall of the hair, neither careless nor posed. The small distances between each of them spoke more than their expressions. 4 people standing together, but only 2 belonging to the same frame of feeling. Lewis said the porter had recognized it immediately. I asked him which porter. He said the same one who'd rung the chapel bell for Latimer. That small coincidence tugged at something in me, though I couldn't yet say what. Later that afternoon, I went to see the man myself. He was in the porter's lodge, polishing the brass rails with a slow, circular devotion. He told me he remembered that photograph being taken, a college fete or some such, all those years ago. He said Miss Lyle had been a guest then, before she took her doctorate, before Latimer had started quoting her poetry at dinner. There was fondness in his tone when he spoke of Latimer, the sort reserved for the kind who remembered birthdays and names. I asked whether the photo had been displayed anywhere. He shook his head. He said Latimer had once kept a copy on his desk but took it down after the Hilary Term of '69. I asked if he knew why. He looked at me, eyes narrowing slightly, and said that some things in Oxford were removed, not because they offended, but because they revealed too much. On the walk back through the quad, the air had turned colder. The rain had stopped, but the stones still glistened like old glass. I found myself studying the windows above the senior common room, imagining those same 4 figures seated again, this time older, quieter, nursing their silences as though they were part of the furniture. That evening I sat at my desk and unfolded the photograph once more. The crease ran straight through Latimer's face. I smoothed it gently, though the damage was already done. My eye caught on something at the edge of the print, a blurred object resting on the garden bench behind them. At first I took it for a book, but under the lamp I saw it was a hat. Latimer's, the same one he'd always worn in later years, soft-brimmed, slightly misshapen. Only it wasn't on his head, it was Greaves who held it, his hand draped casually across the brim, his fingers pressing into the felt. It was nothing, perhaps. But I've learned that ownership, once misplaced, rarely returns unaltered. I turned the photo over. On the back, in faint pencil, was written a single phrase, Michaelmas Ghosts. The handwriting wasn't Latimer's. I would have known that much even in the dark. I slipped it into my coat pocket and poured a drink. The whiskey caught the lamplight the way memory catches guilt. Briefly, then gone. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the half-hour, its note wavering, uncertain. I thought of that photograph again, of the four of them frozen beneath a summer sky, and of all that had been altered since. Time, I've often felt, doesn't erase. It merely retouches, and in the retouching, it sometimes lies. It was late when I returned to my rooms, the city dark except for the faint, uneven glow of bicycles passing across the High. I had brought Latimer's manuscript home with me, a breach of every academic courtesy, though I doubted the dead much cared for protocol. The leather cover was beginning to crack, the clasp bent, the smell faintly of old paper and something else, almost medicinal. I set it beside the lamp and poured myself a drink. The first page stared up at me, patient, withholding. Beneath the title, "The Ghost of Hilary Term," the ink dipped slightly as though his hand had trembled. I had read most of it before, but that evening I began again, slower, waiting for the words to betray themselves. It was in the margin of chapter 1 that I noticed it. A few Latin lines written diagonally, too neat to be idle scribbling. Mortuus terminus veritatis, the dead end of truth. At first glance, merely a phrase to please a classicist's vanity. But the letters had been rearranged in a way that was deliberate, almost mathematical, a cipher, if one knew where to look. I fetched a notebook and began to copy it down, counting each letter, each odd inversion. The pattern emerged gradually, a hidden sequence of initials embedded in the line structure. F.G.L. Fane. Greaves, Lyle, 3 names bound by symmetry. It was elegant in its way, a poem written not to be read, but to accuse. The whiskey caught in my throat. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop somewhere near the Broad, and then silence again, Oxford's most reliable sound. I thought of Latimer, sitting perhaps where I sat now, pen in hand, watching the ink sink into the paper, deciding which truth deserved to die first. I remembered what the librarian had said, that the first chapter was missing. The thought came unbidden. Perhaps the missing pages were not lost at all, but removed by the very people named in this cipher, the dead end of truth indeed. Lewis would have called it conjecture. He had the practical mind for evidence, while I had the curse of theory. Still, I made a small deduction that pleased me. Latimer's handwriting in the coded lines differed slightly from the surrounding text, more deliberate, less fluid. He had written it last, which meant he had time to fear what might follow. I could almost hear his voice in those words. The ghost was speaking, but in the wrong language. When I turned the page, a small slip of paper fluttered out. It was torn from a student exercise book, creased and yellowed. On it, written in pencil, a single line. March 4th. Rehearsal, chapel, 8 p.m. The handwriting wasn't his. I knew the curve of Latimer's letters too well by now. This one was smaller, almost timid. A woman's hand, most likely. I thought of Margaret Lyle again, and the way her fingers had lingered on the piano lid after she'd finished playing. G minor, she had said. Contrition. I wondered if she had written this note, if the rehearsal in question had been music or confession. The temptation to confront her was immediate and immediately suppressed. Oxford has a way of punishing those who rush to conclusions. I have learned to let silence ferment. It tells more than questions ever do. I folded the paper and slipped it into the manuscript, where it belonged. The clock struck midnight, and the sound echoed through the room like a reminder that time, too, was complicit in concealment. Before bed, I turned once more to the Latin. Mortuus terminus veritatis, the dead end of truth. I wrote it out phonetically in English beneath, and noticed something I had missed. The first letters of each Latin word also formed MTV, A meaningless coincidence, perhaps, until I recalled that the manuscript's title began with the same 3 letters. Morse had always loved symmetry, and so, it seemed, had Latimer. It wasn't a message, not exactly, but a mirror. The manuscript reflected its author's life, incomplete, encoded, and doomed to be misread. I closed the cover gently. Somewhere beyond the window, the rain began again, tapping against the glass like an impatient visitor. I did not move to close it. Somehow, I knew that before the term was over, that rain would wash away more than dust. For a time, it all seemed to fit. The ledger lines, the signatures, the quiet adjustments to accounts no one bothered to question. Greaves's arithmetic of deceit had the polish of respectability about it, the sort of fraud that hides beneath the scent of furniture polish and Latin benedictions. I had confronted him late that afternoon in the bursar's office, where the light came through the leaded window in thin stripes like the bars of a cell. He'd listened to my reasoning with professional courtesy, nodding in all the right places, his pen still poised above a column of figures as though what I said were merely an interruption to his day's balancing act. I laid out the pattern, the falsified grant, the altered bequest, the forged resignation that let the college quietly pocket Latimer's share. It had all the symmetry of guilt and none of the color of accident. Greaves didn't deny it. He said only that Latimer had threatened exposure, that the man was unstable, prone to melodrama. He said he'd tried to reason with him, that academics often lost perspective when the world ceased to applaud them. The tone of weary pity in his voice almost convinced me. Almost. But the moment he reached for his spectacles, I noticed the tremor. Not the tremor of guilt, but of irritation. He was tired of being observed. When I left his office, he thanked me for my professional interest and hoped we could put the matter to rest. The phrase lingered unpleasantly. Rest as though truth were a body to be buried. Outside, Lewis waited by the gates, stamping his feet against the cold. He looked pleased when I told him it was done. Greaves's motive was clear, the paperwork sound, the sequence of events disturbingly neat. A financial scandal gone wrong. Death by pressure, not poison. Even the coroner would have nodded. We walked back through the quad. The bell was striking 5, that flat, leaden hour when daylight abandons Oxford to its own reflection. I remember saying to Lewis that closure is a word only policemen use without irony. He didn't answer. He'd learned to let silence fill the gaps I preferred not to cross. But later, at home, with the manuscript open beside me, the neatness began to curdle. I read Latimer's coded lines again, the Latin anagram that looped through his final pages. The letters of mortuus terminus veritatis shifting into names, dates, and accusation. Greaves's name was there, yes, but in a sequence that broke pattern midway through, replaced by something fainter, indecipherable. It was as if the code had hesitated, corrected itself. Truth, it seemed, had a stammer. I poured another drink and let the glass sweat onto the desk. My mind returned to the dinner in the Fellows' Hall weeks earlier, to Fane's misquotation of Tennyson, the one I had tucked away as a curiosity. Scholars misquote only 2 things: lines they never understood, or lines that do not belong to them. It came back with unsettling clarity now. The phrase Fane had twisted was not from In Memoriam at all, but from one of Latimer's unpublished lectures. I knew because I'd read it in the archives. The I-R cadence still exact in my memory. That single detail, the borrowed words, shifted the ground beneath the whole structure I had built. Greaves's guilt, so cleanly arranged, began to fray. Financial crimes leave paper trails, but intellectual ones hide in phrasing, in tone, in the misused rhythm of a borrowed thought. I stared at the page before me. The false solution lay there, gleaming with its own logic, convincing as mathematics, and yet hollow. When I closed the manuscript, the room felt smaller, The air tasted of rain that never quite arrives. Outside, a car passed along the Banbury Road, its headlights briefly flaring across my wall, then gone. It occurred to me then that we are all, in our own ways, accountants of guilt, balancing what can be proved against what must be believed. Greaves had his ledgers, and I had mine. But somewhere between the columns, something human always refuses to add up. The fire crackled low. I wrote one word in my notebook before turning out the lamp. Fane. I knew I was wrong before I wrote it, but sometimes one must record the error to find the truth. And somewhere, perhaps even then, the real ghost of Hilary Term was stirring. I found Fane in his rooms, surrounded by papers that looked as though they'd been arguing amongst themselves. The air smelled faintly of stale tobacco, and guilt disguised as scholarship. He was at his desk, pretending to read, the angle of his head too fixed to belong to concentration. When I entered, he greeted me with the studied politeness of a man who has practiced sincerity in front of a mirror. I said I had been thinking about something he'd mentioned at dinner weeks before, the Tennyson line he'd quoted. He looked up quickly, a flicker of irritation crossing his otherwise composed face. I reminded him of it gently. He frowned, repeated the line again, the same mistake as before. And there it was, the smallest tremor, the thing that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind since that evening. It wasn't Tennyson at all, it was Latimer, a sentence from one of his unpublished lectures, nearly verbatim. Fane noticed my pause. He asked, too casually, whether it mattered. I said it might, depending on what one considered theft. He smiled thinly and began to rearrange his papers, a futile choreography meant to suggest composure. I had seen the gesture before, in courtrooms, confessionals, and classrooms, each time marking the moment when the truth begins to smell faintly of panic. I told him I had read Latimer's manuscript, The Ghost of Hilary Term. The title alone made him flinch. He muttered something about unfinished genius, about the pity of an intellect unraveled by self-importance. But his eyes betrayed him. They wandered to a locked drawer at his side. I asked whether he'd read it. He said yes, parts of it, years ago, at Latimer's invitation. I asked when exactly. His silence was more precise than any date. He rose then, pacing the room. He spoke of competition, of how Latimer had grown erratic, possessive, even paranoid. He said the man saw plagiarism in the shape of a comma. I let him talk. The sentences came out like beads from a snapped rosary, clattering, incomplete. When he stopped, I mentioned the coded poem, the one that named him Greaves and Lyle. For a moment, he froze. Then, with something almost like relief, he said the poem meant nothing. Latin games, he called them. Everyone at Oxford hides behind Latin when English grows dangerous. It was then that I noticed the framed photograph on the mantel, the same one Lewis had shown me, the four of them in the Fellows' garden. But here, the woman's face was no longer turned away. Lyle looked directly at the camera, her expression unreadable, her hand resting lightly on Fane's arm. The original had been cropped. He had restored what Latimer had once chosen to hide. I asked if he'd known about the alteration. He said the photograph had always been that way. I told him gently that it hadn't. The silence that followed was long enough for the ticking of his mantel clock to become oppressive. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. He said Latimer had written lies, that he'd accused them all of theft, of love, of betrayal. He said he had gone to see him that night to demand a retraction. There had been words, anger, a fall on the staircase, an accident. He said it as one might recall the breaking of a teacup. Something regrettable, but inevitable. I asked what he had done then. He looked at me, and in that look there was the fatigue of a man who has repeated a lie so often it has hardened into habit. He said he had tried to help, but it had been too late. Then, quietly, he added that the manuscript had been sealed because Oxford must protect its own. I left him there among his papers and his ghosts. Outside, the corridor was dim, the air sharp with a faint metallic scent of rain about to fall. As I descended the stairs, I thought again of that misquoted line, how Fane had borrowed Latimer's words and made them his own. It was more than vanity. It was confession written in someone else's handwriting. When I reached the quad, the chapel bell tolled. Its note lingered, low and fractured, as if the metal itself were uncertain of its purpose. Back in my rooms, I wrote only one line in my notebook. He spoke as a poet might, borrowing another man's truth to survive his own. And for the first time, I wondered whether Oxford, in all its centuries of brilliance, had ever really known the difference between confession and citation. I went back to St. Oswald's on the final morning of Hilary Term, though I could not have said why. The case, if such a word even applied, had already resolved itself in the usual unceremonious way. An unsigned confession, a sealed report, the faint smell of polish returning to the fellow's staircase. Oxford is adept at erasing scandal. It knows how to tidy grief into paperwork. The chapel stood open. The porter, the same man who had rung that first uncertain bell, nodded as I passed. Inside, the choir was rehearsing, young voices tracing the same pattern Latimer had once called human contrition. The sound wavered slightly in the upper register, as though the air itself were reluctant to forgive. I sat in the last pew, watching dust dance through the light. I had learned enough to fill a report. Fane's theft, his confrontation, the fatal fall on the staircase. Greaves' quiet complicity. Lyle's silence, which was perhaps the most eloquent of all. Each had played their part in the slow, polite destruction of a man too sensitive for the machinery of their world. Yet the truth, if it can be called that, did not feel like revelation. Only fatigue made legible. After the rehearsal ended, I wandered into the quad. The grass was pale with frost, the air carrying the faintest trace of incense from the morning service. Students hurried past, laughing, alive, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already been consecrated by deceit. I found Lyle near the library cloister, a folder under her arm, her expression unreadable. She said she would be leaving Oxford for a while, perhaps indefinitely. I told her that leaving seldom cures what one carries. She smiled at that, not unkindly. Then she said something I have never forgotten, that Latimer had believed too deeply in the moral power of words, while the rest of them had merely used them. We walked together as far as the gate. She asked whether I thought Fane had meant to kill him. I said that intent was the one element never preserved in evidence. She nodded, then turned back toward the chapel, her figure growing smaller against the stone. I did not follow. Later, in the porter's lodge, I signed the visitor's book out of habit. My name followed Latimer's, still faintly visible on the page above. He had signed it in February, his last term, though neither of us knew it then. Beneath his name, in a different ink, someone had written Finis. I ran my finger over the word. The pressure was too deep for the nib of a fountain pen. Perhaps a pencil, perhaps something harder. On the way home, I stopped at Blackwell's and found a slim volume of Tennyson, second-hand, its spine broken halfway through in memoriam. The first line I read was the one Fane had misquoted, the one Latimer had written into his lecture notes years before. I bought it, though I already knew it by heart. That night, I sat by the fire and poured the last of a bottle I'd been saving for no particular reason. The manuscript lay open beside me, the pages now heavy with the weight of understanding. The coded poem, the erased dedication, the note in G minor, all of it formed a kind of fugue, each element echoing the others until meaning blurred into music. I realized, not for the first time, that Oxford does not produce ghosts. It preserves them. It seals them into archives, into manuscripts, into the memory of men like me who mistake curiosity for absolution. Latimer had not been seeking confession. He had been composing one. When the fire had burned down to its last whisper of orange, I closed the manuscript and locked it in a drawer. Some truths are not for circulation. Outside, the city lay hushed under a thin rain. Somewhere far off, a bell struck midnight, measured, solitary, perfect in its imperfection. I thought of Latimer, of Fane, of the fragile machinery of conscience. And I thought, as I often do, that the dead are never truly silent. They simply wait for the right listener.